We've got the top part of the brain is called the cerebrum, and the raised areas are the gyri, and the grooves are the sulci. So you've got this big groove that separates the two hemispheres. That's the longitudinal fissure. You've got this groove right here, which is called the lateral sulcus. You've got a groove right here called the central sulcus that goes from the longitudinal fissure all the way down to the lateral sulcus. That's the central sulcus. On the back here, in between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, that's the transverse fissure. Okay. Now, when you look here at the central sulcus, in front of it is the precentral gyrus, which is where you find the primary motor cortex. Behind the central sulcus is where you have the postcentral gyrus, and that's where you find the primary somatosensory cortex. So, in terms of the lobes, this is the frontal lobe, which is where the precentral gyrus is located, in the frontal lobe. These are the parietal lobes, and this is where you find the postcentral gyrus, or the somatosensory cortex is in the parietal lobe. This is the temporal lobe. The occipital lobe is here in the back. And then the insula, which is another lobe, you have to take the lateral sulcus and pull it down. And when you look right inside, that's the insula right there. Then if you take this and separate it, so you're looking at a sagittal section, this area right here, which is just a bunch of axons carrying information from one hemisphere to the other, that's the corpus callosum. And then here in this middle area, this would be the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is the hypothalamus, which is this area right here, the thalamus, and then the epithalamus is here in the back. Now, the way I always know that I'm looking at the hypothalamus is I look for the optic nerve, and if I go straight back from the optic nerve, I'm in the hypothalamus. I just use that as a landmark. In the hypothalamus, you've got this little circle here. That's your mammillary body. And then hanging off of the hypothalamus is the infundibulum. And the infundibulum connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. So that's all part of the hypothalamus. Then when you go to the thalamus, it's going to look like this round area right here. And then it also, if I pull this back, this is also the thalamus. So the thalamus is actually really big. It just sits up underneath, so it's hard to see from the side. But the round area is the thalamus, and then all of that's the thalamus. And this little dot that's right in the middle, that's called the intermediate mass, or the interthalamic adhesion. And it just connects the two thalamuses together. So you can see it's right there and right there. It just connects the two together. And then if you go back from the thalamus, this area on the back side and slightly up, this would be the epithalamus. So it's on the back side. So hypothalamus, thalamus, epithalamus. And in the epithalamus is where you find the pineal gland, which is right there. And the way I always look for the pineal gland is I look for the colliculi, superior and inferior colliculi, and the pineal gland is just above the superior colliculi. So if that's the superior colliculi, that would be the pineal gland right there. Now those are two different brain regions. The pineal gland is in the epithalamus of the diencephalon, and the superior colliculi is in the mesencephalon, or the midbrain of the brainstem. But I just use it as a good landmark because I can see the two right there. Okay. Then that's the mammillary body of the hypothalamus. So that and that are the same thing. Okay. And then you go down into the brainstem. So the top part of the brainstem would be right here, and that's called the midbrain or the mesencephalon. And the structures in there that you want to know are the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. And then the middle part of the brainstem is the pons. That's the part that sticks out on the anterior side. And then you go into the medulla oblongata, is the most inferior part of the brainstem. And then you would go into spinal cord after that. Okay. So then if we should do the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is back here. And there's two hemispheres to the cerebellum. This would go on this side. This would be over here. And for the cerebellum, when you look at this sagittal section, you can see all this white matter in here, which is just axons sending information to the cerebellum or sending information away from the cerebellum. And that white matter kind of looks like a tree branches, and so it's called the arbor vitae. So the white matter in the cerebellum is called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life. So then if we look here at the different ventricles that are in the brain. So you've got two lateral ventricles or lateral horns, and they kind of curve around like this, and they're inside of here. So if we pull this up, that would be the lateral ventricle right there, and that's where CSF would be found. And again, that will be in each of the hemispheres. In the cerebral hemispheres, you have the lateral ventricles. And then the third ventricle runs right along the midline, and it's formed from the wall of this thalamus, and then the wall of the thalamus over here form the walls of the third ventricle. So this is the third ventricle right here. Runs right along the midline. So CSF goes from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricles, and then it goes down through this little passageway called the Cerebral Aqueduct, or the aqueduct of the midbrain. And I always look for the colliculi. The aqueduct sits right in front of it. So you go lateral ventricles, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, and then into the fourth ventricle right here. And you can also see the fourth ventricle right here as well. The fourth ventricle is in between the cerebellum and the pons. That would be the fourth ventricle. And then from the fourth ventricle, it would go into the central canal of the spinal cord. And then the other thing that you can see on here is if you put the brain together and look at the underside of the brain, you can see the olfactory bulbs are right here, and then the olfactory tract is right here. So these are just axons that are coming from the nose up through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid, which would be like right here, and then going into the brain. That's the olfactory tract, and then where they stop are the olfactory bulbs. Then the optic nerves are coming from the eyes. That would be right here. So leaving the eyes, you've got axons that are the optic nerve, and they come right here and right here. And where those nerves cross, that right there is the optic chiasm. And then those axons continue down this way and down this way to the thalamus where they synapse. And where those axons continue right here from the optic chiasm to the thalamus, those are the optic tracts. So it goes optic nerves, they cross at the optic chiasm, and then optic tract goes to the thalamus. Okay. I think that covers the brain.